Podcasting, the latest frontier. These are the episodes of a Catch as Catch Can podcast. Its continuing mission: to explore strange, nerdy topics, to chat about sports, movies, sci-fi, and so much more. To boldly pod where this nerd has gone before. Captain's log, pod date 0526.19. On this episode of Too Boldly Pod, we will take a look at the brand new released teaser trailer of the new television show coming to CBS All Access called Picard, or Star Trek Picard, if you will. Also, my buddy Dave joins me, and we discuss something very cool to him and I, hopefully to all of you too. We discuss wrestling heat. If you don't know what that is, be sure to stick around. I think you'll enjoy the conversation. Also, we have a fun little Too Boldly Pod question this week surrounding shows you loved that you didn't really like how they ended. And we have a fun little news story all about the Easter Island heads and tourists picking their noses. So, Scotty, set phasers on stun, engage. This past week, we were treated with the release of the teaser/trailer for the new Star Trek program called Picard.
15 years ago, today, you led us out of the darkness. You commanded the greatest rescue armada in history. Then, the unimaginable. What did that cost you? Your faith? Your faith in us? Your faith in yourself. Tell us, why did you leave Starfleet, Admiral?
Picard is due to be released sometime in late 2019, and it's going to be available on CBS All Access here in the United States, and from what I understand, Netflix and other streaming venues worldwide. So I try not to really look into too much of what a show is because of I try to build up the excitement in and of myself. Well, so let's just go over it. It's executive produced by Alan Kurtzman and Patrick Stewart and others, and it's essentially the premise is set in the 24th century, about 20 years after the events of the 2002 movie Star Trek Nemesis, and the storyline will be affected by the destruction of Romulus from the film Star Trek in 2009. So you're kind of wondering whether this is going to be the alternate universe that we've seen these latest Star Trek movies come from, or whether it's going to be the alpha universe, for lack of a better term. I'm excited to see this. A lot of people I know get sort of negative people my age, people older than me, original Star Trek fans, if you will, they get kind of defensive about Discovery. And Discovery hasn't necessarily been my favorite series out of all these Star Trek series, but I appreciate it for what it is. But this one I am really, really looking forward to, and I cannot wait for Star Trek Picard to debut. You have any thoughts about it, or maybe you've read into it? Let me know on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod, and we can revisit this topic when it comes closer for Picard to debut. Each week I like to have a little fun and incorporate my friends from social media here on this podcast by asking little harmless Too Boldly Pod questions that people are free to answer at their leisure. And this week, with the series finale of Game of Thrones concluding this past week, my question was, I didn't watch Game of Thrones, but I'm seeing a lot of negative reaction to the final episode or how it finished. That said, what show that you loved did you not like how it ended? And I got a lot of great responses for that. Jeremiah replied, The Punisher. It didn't end. It got canceled. Jim answered, Carnival, Sense8, and Veep. Kate replied, a lot of people hated the way Seinfeld ended. I was not crazy about it at the time, but I will say that I recently rewatched it, and it made so much more sense in retrospect. It's like the writers and creators got something about the show and the characters that I'm not sure we all understood at the time. So I think that's a finale that weirdly redeems itself. Kate also went on to reply, The Brady Bunch, oh my God, the hair tonic episode. WTF, that might be the worst last episode ever. Yeah, I just stuck that comic book guy in for, my own sake. It wouldn't be Kate saying that. Anyways, my friend Narek said, I was gifted the entire series of The Sopranos in a really nice box set by my in-laws. Though I know how it ends, and it was controversial, I'm embarrassed to say I've never finished watching it. Not yet, anyways. Andy replied Magnum P.I. and Remington Steele. Dave, whom you will hear shortly, talking about Wrestling Heat, answered Charles in Charge. The way Charles woke up in bed with Joni and to find out it was all just a dream was a big letdown. You son of a... Jenny replied Dexter. Kimber replied Lost. Kathy also replied Seinfeld and went on to say, in being a Game of Thrones watcher, I didn't mind how it ended. A few people dying and playouts made me upset. I feel the ending was a little too rushed, but I thought it was pretty awesome that... No, I'm not going to give any spoilers, so I won't read the rest of it. Carol replied, having never watched anything all the way through, I've never been disappointed. That being said, Supernatural ends next season, so shall we see? It better be amazing. And as for me, there's a lot of shows that I hated that they ended. They got canceled, like Jeremiah said. But one that I really loved that I wasn't too keen on how it ended was actually The X-Files. It was such a great program, and then after David Duchovny left and then came back as his periodic little appearances on the show, it started to go downhill from there, and it was no fault of Robert Patrick and Annabeth Gish, but it just didn't have the same energy it had before. And then for them to end the movie off with Mulder and Scully embracing and a kiss just kind of didn't do it for me. Nothing against romance in TV shows or movies. It's just there was always that tension, sexual tension, but it was always a very professional tension. And you could see the earnest friendship and care they had for one another. And I just didn't think that was the appropriate way for that program to end. So thank you to everybody that took the time to answer this week's question. And if you have any thoughts or you want to share what television show you weren't exactly keen on how it ended, let me know on Facebook or Twitter at TooBoldlyPod. I'm joined, as I periodically am, by my buddy Dave, and we're going to discuss wrestling heat. Dave, tell them what wrestling heat actually is before we get into it.
Wrestling heat. Okay, well, there's different types of heat. They want to say nuclear heat, which is kind of like heat that you don't necessarily want, because that's you're going to get a outside forces calling in and complaining and getting shut off. Mainly, it's to get the crowd riled up against the villain, against the heel. The other part is it allows the face, the good guy, to be cheered.
So we created a list. I didn't necessarily come up with 5 because I couldn't narrow everything down, so I just went with 3, and I'm going to play off of you. So we came up with a list, well, won't give it a number, of the wrestlers that drew the best heat. So go ahead and lead it off.
My list might be a little bit different than some people's, because I was looking at when there was actually heat in the wrestling business, and that sometimes you got to go back to the territory days.
Right.
One guy that not everybody might recognize right off the get-go, and I'll just start it off. Guy named by the name of Kevin Sullivan. I'm talking about his Florida days, and you got to kind of remember what the world was like 35 years ago, and remember that Florida, even with Miami and other newer cities, I guess, Florida is still the South, and you're in the middle of the Bible Belt. And Sullivan came up with a gimmick of being the Prince of Darkness. Now, he never said that he was satanic, but people believed that he was. And he had, down there in Florida, he had one of the biggest baby faces, good guys, to work off, and that was Dusty, Big Dust. And one thing that you can really draw heat from is, especially being in the South, is he evil? Is he satanic? And, oh my God, he's beating the crap out of Dusty Rhodes. So that was, they had, I don't know what it was, ended up being a 4 or 5 year run down there in Florida where Sullivan was just red hot with that whole gimmick. And, you know, he had Bob Roop, who again, people, not everybody remember that name, but he was an old school wrestler, a legitimate Olympic style wrestler and whatnot. And the storyline was he brainwashed Bob Roop, and Bob Roop had half his hair shaved off and had makeup on and all. You know, it was kind of like seeing, you know, Bob Backlund or Kurt Angle as this crazy lunatic, which was really shocking at the time.
Now, one that I came up with, I think we agreed on, was Piper during the first WrestleMania. That was some high-quality heat.
Oh, well, yeah, Piper, you and I have had this discussion before, and I can't remember exactly how I break it down, but what was called what became Hulkamania. Hulkamania started off in AWA, but what became Hulkamania in Vince's world had a lot, of course, had to do with Hulk Hogan. It had to do with the Iron Sheik having the belt before Hogan. It had to do with a lot with Vince coming up with the idea and running with it. And the other part of it is Piper. Because if Hulkamania didn't have Piper, Hulkamania wouldn't have been Hulkamania.
No.
When it first, between, I want to say 84 to 86-ish, before Piper went Hollywood, when he got, and fans started cheering. And the thing about Piper, that was national heat.
Right.
Okay. That was worldwide heat. Piper, you can go all the way back to the 70s, and with him being in Los Angeles, okay, and he's in a program against Chavo Classic, okay, and stuff that you would definitely not get away with now, but he really played off on getting heat from the Latino crowd. And one famous story was he was terrorizing the Guerrero family so much, Chavo Classics in particular, that he wanted to make amends to it. And he wanted to apologize. Of course, Piper legitimately played the bagpipes. And he offered to play the Mexican national anthem on the bagpipes. Chavo Classic, being the baby face that he was at the time, being the good guy, believed him. So Piper's going to play the Mexican national anthem on the bagpipes, and he breaks out into La Cucaracha, which just about caused a friggin' riot at I think it's called the Olympic Auditorium out there in Los Angeles.
So who's next on your list?
Next, because this kind of goes back to what I talk about when there was actually legitimate heat. When people, I think people always kind of knew something was up with the wrestling business, but they wanted to suspend belief for a few hours on a Friday or Saturday night. Not the Iron Sheik. Iron Sheik was a good heat magnet too, but the original Sheik, Ed Farhat, who just happens to be from Michigan here. People thought legitimately that this guy was absolutely insane. And he was throwing fireballs at people, acting like he was going to throw fireballs at the crowd. He had snakes that he brought to the ring long before Jake and Vince ever thought of it. The Sheik had snakes in the ring in the 60s and 70s, caused riots to break out in Toronto and Detroit, on a weekly basis. He kept, I told you the story that I heard from his nephew Sabu. He kept kayfabe really good because he not everybody knew it at the time, but he owned the territory here in Detroit.
Big time wrestling.
Company. Yep. It was his company. So he, would have a big time good guy come in for a program, whether it be a week or a month or whatever. Sometimes it was the NWA champion, whether it be Dory Jr., something like that. Or it might just be a big face like Bobo Brazil. The funny story, this is according to Sabu, Sheik would still have the face, the good guy that he brought in for the program, stay at his house, stay at the Sheik's house. He had a big house outside of Lansing or whatever. Well, the thing was, there were basically two sides to the house. Even though he had this face, this good guy staying in his house, the good guy was not allowed to come to the family side with Sheik's legit family. He had his own bathroom, his own kitchen, his own dining room or whatever. And the family wasn't allowed to visit with Dory Jr. or Bobo or whoever it was or whatever. He would still accommodate, because it was helping his business, bringing this big time name in. But he was keeping kayfabe so much that he basically wanted to kind of, I guess, portray to even his family that even though I invited this guy in the house, we don't like each other, even though that they probably kind of knew it was BS.
You mentioned nuclear heat earlier, and one of my suggestions you commented was nuclear heat, and that was when Sergeant Slaughter turned for WrestleMania 7, 6?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that's about right.
Now, I never knew if they changed the venue from outdoors to indoors because of that heat or because of everything happening with the war or not. Did you ever hear anything about that?
Well, part of it was the heat that they were getting. Another part, which didn't come out until years later, that Vince, of course, didn't want anybody to know, is their ticket sales were down.
Oh.
And it wasn't because of the program, because the program was red hot, but the wrestling business was down at the time, and they didn't think they could fill another huge stadium like what they had done to Silverdome.
Right.
So they flinched and moved it.
But that was still
it still would have been, they would have still 45,000 people, but they were trying to fill it up that seated 65,000.
Right.
So 45,000 is still a lot of people, but when you got 20,000 empty seats, all of a sudden it looks empty, even though it's still a lot of people.
Now, the last one I was going to bring up, we sort of talked about, and it's sort of in that era, and I thought that was the biggest modern heat, was not necessarily the NWO, but when they pulled off the whole Outsiders invasion thing. That first few weeks or months was some incredible heat that almost got everybody buying into it.
Yeah, that was right around the time where everything, even though people suspected stuff, everything was finally just kind of coming out and whatnot. But it was funny, even though people thought they knew, when Hall and Nash came down and then Hogan turned on it was Sting and Macho, people weren't sure. they were like, what the heck is going on here? Maybe we're not as smart as we think we are. But yeah, people, when Hall came down first, people legitimately thought that he was still working for WWF, that Vince sent him down.
Right.
And that being a Southern company at the time still, and WWF being the Northern Yankees and whatnot, there was a thing there where the Southern wrestling fans didn't want the WWF brand or style in their wrestling.
It was the most brilliant thing that Bischoff ever did, and even though he stole it from Japan.
Yes, he did. He still doesn't admit that, but he.
So what else you got on your list?
Okay, well, just I don't know, honorable mentions. Jake the Snake. He had he dropped Steamboat on his head on Saturday night's main event with a DDT.
Right.
Later on, a few years later, after turning face and going back heel, he had that Cobra bite Macho Man,
yep.
Which was a legitimate bite. They couldn't get they could not get that snake to release it. That was not a work. And then there's prior stuff too from Jake's territory days, whether it be down in Mid-South in Georgia and over in World Class. And even though he was the face there, it was still a big deal. He DDT'd a lady valet when he was blinded. He didn't know what he was doing. So, in 1985, that was a huge deal.
Right.
Mae Young wasn't going through tables and stuff, We kind of got numb to everything. But striking a woman at the time was a big deal.
You pay attention more to modern day wrestling than I do, obviously, because I don't watch it. But does anybody now even come close to the heat from the old days, or is it totally different? And I made a list. The best I could, the closest I could come up with, when Chris Jericho is a heel, he is spot on. Right.
And what I'm saying is the closest I can get was still a few years ago. Okay. Edge, when Edge was heel, he was a fantastic heel, I thought. Kurt Angle, when he was heel, that was and that's, I guess maybe I shouldn't say that. I laugh when he was heel, but you shouldn't laugh at a heel. I'm breaking my own rule. I haven't been doing my usual shtick or funny stuff this week because we're talking about heat, damn it. And heat is supposed to be real. It's not supposed to be funny. And damn it, if you want heat and you want heels, quit cheering them. Damn it, boo them, get mad at them.
Well, that's kind of how Austin and The Rock got so big. Weren't they supposed to be heel characters, and everyone just started cheering them? Yep,
that's everybody. Well, okay, Rock and Austin. Yep, people started cheering them. And another one that I thought about was Brett and HBK, because that was kind of unusual because they were both heel and faces at the same time.
Right.
Depending on where the damn match was at. Okay. It was kind of like they were supposed to both be heels, but depending on how close to the Canadian border it was booked, Brett might get cheered or booed. And same thing with HBK when they were together.
How much do you think color guys like Jesse and even farther back to the older days assisted in drawing heat, or do you think it was more the in-ring heat?
You're saying the announcers?
Right.
I'm sorry. Yeah. No, definitely the announcers had a lot to do with it. When whoever came up with, there's always debate on who comes up with stuff first. Whatever. I'm not going to get into that. But when they figured out that having a heel commentator cheering on the bad guys and ripping the heels,
right,
would get everybody over, that was money. And Jesse was good at it, of course. Bobby, and there were Jim Cornette when they different companies put Cornette broadcast booth, whether it be the early World Championship Wrestling on TBS,
right,
when they would have him fill in when Shivani or Crockett or whatever were on a bender. They'd have Cornette in there or whatever. And I do have a few more honorable mentions. I don't want to
fire away.
I kind of talked about it. I'll just do this quick. The Freebirds as a group.
That was a great one.
Drew huge heat down in Mid-South Louisiana. They blinded Junkyard Dog. Whether good or bad, there was some, I guess, racial overtones to it, which drew money. People might cringe now, but it put money in everyone's pocket.
Right.
And then they had a big feud over in Texas with the Von Erichs, which was
they'd have been nothing without
money.
them.
Yeah, it was huge money. To kind of go back to Jim Cornette, I know we kind of agreed we were going to talk about mostly wrestlers, but the Midnight Express, whether it was Dennis and Bobby or Bobby and Stan, they got tremendous heat, beating up blue-eyed baby faces, whether it was the Rock and Roll Express or the Fantastics, and they would do nasty, dirty stuff to these guys, break their noses and people, and this is back when people got into it and believed this stuff. All these little teeny boppers and everything, they thought that Dennis and Bobby were killing Ricky Morton every night. Another one, Tully was, in my opinion, was a classic chicken shit heel.
Right.
Excuse my slang, and he was cocky, he was arrogant. Some people may say he was Ric Flair light, but he kind of had his own, he was kind of different than Nate, but, he could draw some heat. Another one, and I put this in because I believe it, and I also put it in for you, is Nick Bockwinkel.
Right.
He had a big rivalry with Verne for all those years. His interviews, he talked in big words. He was aloof, arrogant. He had Bobby as his manager, and people would just listen to him and just get so friggin' irritated at this arrogant jerk.
Right. Well, before you move on, let me ask you about Nick Bockwinkel, because I was watching the network, I don't know, a month or so ago, and it was one of those handful of matches that Vince brought him in to be an announcer for. Whatever happened with that? Because it didn't seem like he was there for very long.
That's a story that I heard, and I can't quite remember how that happened. It was in the time frame where he was on ESPN for Verne at AWA. All of a sudden, he pops in for a cup of coffee with Vince. But then he still went back to Verne and had the belt, I think, at least one more time. I'm sure more than one of Verne's checks bounced over the years to these guys, but maybe he made the mistake of bouncing one of his big time guys. But,
right.
Yeah, Nick showed up for a cup of coffee, then went back.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. I've heard the story, and I can't quite remember what it is. And to stay in the AWA, one guy probably would have just been a generic mid-card babyface to his entire life, but he made a career, and made a good career out of it, and he turned on Bruno, and that's Larry Zbyszko.
Yep.
He probably would have just been Tony Gurria 2.0, kind of mid-carding it throughout the 80s and whatnot. But when he turned down Bruno, and I wasn't old enough to be getting WWF at the time because they hadn't gone national yet, so I learned about all this later on. But when he turned down Bruno, that was just because Bruno was so popular, and Larry Legend, he made a career out of being a heel after that.
You know me, I always preferred the heels anyways.
I know. I do too. I was a little boy and I turned it on TV 25 on a Saturday morning and found Georgia Championship Wrestling. I was drawn to the Masked Superstar, the Spoiler, Piper, Buzz Sawyer. Oh, well, you and I kind of talked about this, but let's give them their props. We don't want to leave them out. Kind of old timers. Before my time,
yeah,
I'm not sure.
I knew that was coming.
But Gorgeous George,
yep,
and Buddy Rogers, they were the classic platinum blonde, chicken shit heels, and they were made for television. And you remember better when there were 4 networks: ABC, CBS, NBC, and Dumont.
Right. Me and my Moxie Cola.
They were made for television. Gorgeous George, his entrances, spraying everybody with his perfume and sanitizing the referee's hands before he checked George.
Right.
Just got people so friggin' mad. And this is another thing that I kind of, a good heel, and this is why I mentioned Tully. He wasn't small or anything, but sometimes a good heel isn't necessarily a monster heel. It's somebody that the crowd looks at and says, wait a minute, I could take that guy.
Right.
I could take him. So he might not necessarily be the biggest, or the most muscular, but somebody that the crowd says, wait a minute, that guy's not so tough. I could take him, but somehow he wins anyways, and it just gets people so mad. Gorgeous George and Buddy Rogers are kind of the blueprint, I guess, of drawing heat.
Well, you said that, and it brought up a memory of one of the WrestleManias when Honky Tonk was wrestling, and I remember specifically Jesse saying sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, and Honky is lucky. Yep.
And Honky, and you and I, we joke about Honky Tonk, but Honky Tonk was a great heel, in my opinion.
Yes, he was.
He's kind of like what I was just saying. People were certain that they could beat this guy,
right?
But somehow he beat Tito and all the faces that looked better than him, that looked more muscular, that looked more athletic, but somehow he'd still walk out with the belt,
right?
And it would get people so mad. And now they just they pass the belts around like a piece of cake. Everyone gets a slice.
So any wrap up on Heat before we release you in your 2 minutes of stand up?
No, well we forgot the biggest heel of all time, the Gooch from Different Strokes.
Yeah.
You never saw him.
No, you didn't.
Everybody was scared of him. Well, he was the Gooch. So, no, I think I'm looking at my list. I think I've kind of said, this is I don't want to say mid-range heel, but $1 Million Man.
Oh, he was a great one.
Oh, yeah. Offering to pay, a kid $100 if he can bounce a basketball 20 times or whatever, and knock it out of the kid's hands at 19, and having it was a young Rob Van Dam kissing his feet or licking his shoes or something.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. This is another thing, not saying it's good or bad or acceptable or anything, but he had an African-American manservant, which
had
drew
the undertones.
Yeah, undertones. Like, wait a minute, what is going on here? That he treated like crap. That was a fantastic character, in my opinion.
I agree totally. All right, so any closer that you want before we wrap this up?
No, I think I'm good. I think I'm good this week. I actually don't have a closer for this week.
You don't have a bit? Thanks, Dave. We'll
Okay, I appreciate it, and whenever you need help, just give me a call, Stan.
That will do, Dave. And our news story for the week comes from HuffPost, and the headline is Easter Island statues threatened by nose-pick selfie-snapping tourists. Legions of tourists are unable to resist snapping nose-pick selfies with the gigantic statues on Easter Island. Now, an archaeologist has warned that tourists are disrespecting the statues by climbing on them, sitting on graves, and trampling preserved spaces. Joanne Van Tilburg said that last year, visitors to Easter Island reached 150,000, a rise from just 2,500 in the early 1980s. The heads of the Easter Island figures, but often overlook the fact that they also have bodies. Archaeologists at the University of California, Los Angeles, have developed the Easter Island Statue Project to dig deeper into these Pacific Island icons to explore what's below the surface. The answer? Full-body statues measuring as much as 33 feet high. She says the influx of visitors is having a troubling impact on the island's delicate ecosystem. She states, I am troubled by the lack of genuine tourist interest in the island and its people. Really? Easter Island? Statues? Nose pick selfies? The hell is wrong with mankind? And that's going to wrap up this week's Too Boldly Pod. I hope you enjoyed our little look at Star Trek Picard. I hope you enjoyed Dave and I's little conversation about heat in professional wrestling. I hope you had fun with our Too Boldly Pod question about TV shows you loved that just didn't quite seem to end the way you wanted them to, and our little news article about nose-picking selfies on Easter Island. As usual, I don't have a closer to this show, but being we played the teaser trailer for Picard, I'll just simply say this. Thank you all for tuning in. If you have any feedback you'd like to give to us, let us know on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod, and make it so.
WLLP Spock Rock Radio.